This is Hedonism Wines. It's one of the most expensive, if not the most expensive wine shop in all of London. Here you can buy a vintage bottle of wine or 55-year-old whiskey for as much as £120,000. Its owner is this man, Russian multi-millionaire Yevgeny Chichvarkin. But selling fine wine and spirits have not always been his calling. Chichvarkin used to own one of Russia's leading mobile phone companies. But in 2008 he was accused of kidnapping and extortion. Charges he claims were made up by corrupt officials wanting bribes. He sold his business and bought a one-way ticket to London.
There is no corruption here. If you read that member of parliament pay government money for some tickets to Spain, he fired immediately. Yeah, for Russian mind there is no corruption at all.
Little or no corruption plus a business-friendly visa for those with more than £1 million to invest has made London a magnet for Russian and Soviet-born oligarchs for years. The latest Sunday Times rich list included 3 of them among the UK's 5 richest men. Among them, Chelsea Football Club owner Roman Abramovich, who made his fortune of €18 billion back in the 90s during the former USSR's privatization period of its petrol companies. Or Uzbek-born Alisher Usmanov, Russia's richest man and co-owner of the Arsenal Football Club. But they aren't all Russian either. Ukraine's richest man, oligarch Rinat Akhmetov, paid £140 million for an apartment at One Hyde Park, said to be the world's most expensive address. And they haven't just bought expensive flats or mansions. They've also invested in the London stock market and city, using money some critics argue hasn't always been the cleanest. It's estimated that Russian and Eastern European buyers represent 10% of luxury residences. But for this estate agency director, he hasn't seen a rush of new potential buyers from the East because of the ongoing crisis in Ukraine.
London's always been a relatively safe haven. You've got the security of ownership of any property. You trust the system, they trust the legal system. We are much more welcoming than a lot of countries. They don't feel that suddenly the rules are going to change and you can't own that property anymore, and vice versa.
But for some, the rules have changed, rules that could possibly put a strain on the financial honeymoon between London and its rich Russians. Last March, following the annexation of Crimea by Russia, the US and the EU imposed sanctions on certain individuals said to be close to Putin. Sanctions that include freezing assets and blocking visas to travel abroad. Yet while the US has also sanctioned Russian companies, banks and their CEOs, the EU has gone more for Russian politicians and army leaders. Some argue it's a political compromise. The EU is Russia's biggest trading partner and it imports over 80% of Russia's gas and oil.
EU sanctions have tended to focus on those directly responsible for Russian policy to Ukraine. So it's been military people who are on the ground in Crimea, Russian parliamentarians who were instrumental in pushing through certain pieces of legislation, including the resolution that allows President Putin to deploy troops to Ukraine. Whereas Putin's inner circle, those business people, the people who actually have the houses in London, the children in British schools and universities, the estates in the home counties, those people aren't directly involved. And so EU sanctions thus far haven't really touched them, and it would be difficult to do so.
It's estimated that companies from Russia and former Soviet states have invested over $82 billion in London in the past 2 decades. But 2 months after the first sanctions were introduced, has London, or more specifically the city, felt any effect from them?
Sanctions are fairly limited. They are limited to a number of individuals, the companies they control, but they're not really, they don't really bite in terms of having direct legal effect on Russian companies doing business in the UK or UK financial institutions doing business with Russian companies. But where the sanctions are a bit damaging is where they create the atmosphere of uncertainty and suspicion, hostility, call it what you will.
Bill Browder has made sanctions against Putin a personal mission ever since his lawyer Sergei Magnitsky died in a Moscow prison in 2009. Magnitsky had just revealed a huge corruption scam involving $230 million in fraud when he was arrested. Magnitsky was working for Browder's investment fund company in Russia. Browder eventually got the U.S. to sanction those involved in Magnitsky's death, but the EU never followed. He says the EU needs to get tougher against Putin.
The Europeans have sanctioned a certain number of people, but they haven't touched the Putin oligarchs, the guys who hold Putin's money. And if you want to stop Putin from doing all this terrible stuff, you have to impose a cost on him. Putin has a lot of money, and he holds that money in the names of other people. And the United States has started to touch those people, but the Europeans have deliberately not. And there's a real problem if you want to sanction people, but you don't sanction the right people.
But does Putin deserve to be sanctioned for annexing Crimea or for placing Russian troops on Ukraine's border? Many Russians argue no, that if anything, NATO is to blame. That back in 1994, when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for recognition of its borders by both the West and Russia, the agreement also contained a provision of neutrality, a provision Moscow said was broken by NATO.
No. Of course, we know that Ukraine, as well as Georgia back in 2008, toyed with the idea of NATO membership. And NATO membership was dangled in front of them, even though the prospect of that was never particularly realistic. But it's again this threat of NATO emerging right on Russia's doorstep that pushed things off the cliff. And that's resulted in Crimea, in the annexation, or the reunification, as the Crimeans and Russians would term that. But it's, on the part of Russia, it was a defensive step.
A defensive step that has seen President Putin's popularity rise to record levels of 80%. For many Russians, annexing Crimea is seen as a just cause, one which has given Russia a new sense of national identity and one which sanctions can't take away. For some, the effect of the sanctions, like Putin himself, are unpredictable.
Although it's possible to impose a great deal of pain, it's not possible to determine what the political result of that pain will be. Yes, potentially broad sectoral sanctions and banking sanctions could do huge damage to the Russian economy, could fracture support for Putin, could maybe force him to seek a settlement. It could also, however, consolidate the Russian regime. It could push out progressives, technocrats, pro-Western elements from within the Russian elite. And you could actually result in Russia that's much more isolationist, much more difficult to deal with, and we're no better off in Ukraine. And that's the dilemma for Western policymakers. There's their own costs and there's the very uncertain benefits.